teachings of the Magisterium and our friend and doctor, St. Thomas Aquinas. We ask through his intercession that we would be always illuminated to know and to love the truth. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Good. Thank you all for being here. We've made it through these 4 weeks, 8 weeks if you count the series that we did in October. But yeah, this has been a lot of fun, and I'm really looking forward to tonight. I was telling some of the people here that I know last week was challenging. This week I expect to be equally challenging, but maybe in different ways and for different people. So I look forward to that. So let me just say a little bit, wrapping up, reflecting on our conversation last week, because we have, through this series, been going through the meaning of the natural law, which, anybody kind of recall what we mean by natural law? I know it's not a yes or no question. It's not so the natural law is, first we have the eternal law, which is basically reason itself. It's God's governance of the universe. The natural law is then our human imprint of that, the way in which we, through understanding reason, understanding the way things work, what is it for, that kind of thing, that we can discern what is right and what is good through the use of natural reason. So we call it the natural law. So we have seen, Thomas Aquinas has helped us to see how the Ten Commandments are an iteration of the natural law, our obligations towards God, towards our neighbor. And so this is a helpful summary, the Ten Commandments are, of what is good, what is bad, in a very general sense. So these give us some key principles to understand those things. All of these then are conclusions that we can come through the use of the natural law, through the use of reason. Now, what we find, though, like last week and maybe again tonight, is that sometimes we don't like the conclusions of natural law reasoning, and so we kind of butt up against it. But I would just encourage us to remember kind of what are the principles at stake here, because if you don't like the conclusions of the natural law and therefore decide to do something else, just be aware of the fact that then that means that you're starting from scratch. That now you have to then decide what then is it, what do we mean when we say something is good? Because, again, back in October in this series, I think we all kind of had a consensus understanding that the what is it for, what's a good chair, what's a good clock. I mean, we went through all those things, and everybody kind of agrees, yeah, I guess that's what we mean by good, but sometimes the conclusions of that rub us the wrong way. Well, if that's the case, if you want to throw it out, realize that now you're starting from scratch. So then what does it mean for something to be good? Because ultimately what a lot of people are doing, not accusing anyone here, but just realizing that we have a tendency to judge as good or bad kind of what we feel like, if we're honest, right? But if we don't have these hard principles and these rules that we abide by, even when it's difficult, then you have to realize that in that case, such a person is not really working within a system. They're just doing what they feel like. And if what they feel like happens to line up with 9 out of the 10 commandments, well, it's only kind of coincidentally, right? Because you've already shown that the principles are really not what you're holding on to. You have some other system, and so it's worth asking yourself, well, if I don't agree with this, then what is my system? How do I determine what is good and what is bad? Because maybe you trust yourself to say, well, I have just kind of a good moral sense, and so I'm willing to go with my own gut when it comes to those decisions. But do you feel that way about other people? Do you trust them to just go with their gut? Or isn't the whole point of ethics and morality is to be able to lay down clear rules? Because if you don't have that, then we're all kind of blowing in the wind. Ken, you had a
question. Yeah, I've heard the term natural law, like going all the way back to when I was a freshman in college.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, when Rousseau and Locke and those guys are talking about natural law, are they all talking about the same thing? So like maybe the other kinds of law, no, but natural law is it pretty much, so like does everyone understand natural law to be the same?
Well,
like more or less, or?
Yes, I mean, so what a lot of the early moderns were pushing against was the idea that anything has what Aristotle would call a final cause. So a lot of modern philosophy is actually a rejection of this idea of things having a natural purpose. And so they might have things that they describe as natural in their own sense, but it's a very different philosophical framework because they see the human subject often as being kind of self-directed and not having any intrinsic purpose. And nature itself has no intrinsic purpose, and therefore you can kind of do, that's what you see, there's a tendency, more Hobbesian things, you start to get into Nietzsche and might makes right, because things don't have a natural purpose. So there, in that period, early modern philosophy, there begins to be a departure from really what the medievals would consider natural law. Yeah.
I still remember the moment, remember the moment, first quarter, freshman year at Stanford. I'm in modern European history, and I just happened to make the offhanded comment that Thomas Aquinas had in Summa had proved the existence of God by 5 different ways, and the teaching system just, as a professor in training, just offhandedly says, well, don't you know? No, that's all been disproved by Kant, by whoever. But I mean, it's okay because they have their own way of proving things. Like, I was up against something from the very.
No, it's very true. It's very true. All right. Well, let's press forward. Again, I think tonight's conversation will be interesting. Will be challenging in different ways. But just a kind of a refresher on what we meant by the natural law. So who remembers the 10 Commandments? So the first commandment is what? Okay, we're the articulation there's a little, yes.
All your being.
Well, that is the first commandment in a general sense, when Jesus says there are 2. But the first of the 10 commandments is, you shall have no other gods before me. So the 1 reminds us that there is only one God, you shall have no other gods before me. So that's number 1. Number 2, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, right? What was commandment number 3?
Keep the Lord's Day holy.
Keep holy the Lord's Day, very good. And the 4th commandment? Honor your father and mother. The 5th commandment? You shall not kill. The 6th commandment? Don't commit adultery. The 7th commandment? Don't steal. The 8th commandment? Not to bear false witness or to lie, yeah. The 9th commandment? Okay, this is you, this is your neighbor. And very close to your neighbor is your neighbor's wife. Okay, don't covet your neighbor's wife is number 9. Number 10 is don't covet your neighbor's goods. That's right. Okay, so a quick word, as we're coming to the end, let's consider the whole. I thought it would be worth taking a small detour to ask this question about how the 10 Commandments are divided. Because you might hear, for instance, from some Protestants, that the Catholics have removed one of the 10 Commandments. Anybody ever heard that before? Okay, well, you haven't spent enough time around Protestants. So, myself, having grown up a Protestant, it was very common, and you'll still hear that today, that the Catholics have removed one of the 10 Commandments. Well, what are they talking about? Well, Protestants typically order the commandments differently. So here's how that looks. The first commandment as a whole, see, because this, of course, is all just kind of summarizing. We're condensing a little bit. So in Exodus, the first commandment as a whole reads like this. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall not have other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything in the heavens above or the earth below or in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down before them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, inflicting punishment for their ancestors' wickedness on the children of those who hate me, down to the third and fourth generation, but showing love down to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. So that's really, if you're reading Scripture, that's the first commandment. Now, the Protestant division of the Ten Commandments is to take this first line, you shall have no other gods before me, as the first, and the second being, you shall not make for yourself an idol. So they take this commandment and split it into two. We Catholics typically will count this all as one commandment.
How many commandments do they have?
Okay. So,
why do they combine?
so then 9 and 10, the two coveting commandments, they say simply, the 10th commandment is you shall not covet, period. Okay. So where we divide the final two, they combine the first two. So that's where the difference is. So don't let anybody ever trick you or trip you up to say that Catholics removed one of the 10 commandments. This we take as one commandment. The Protestants, and you might see why, they want to treat you shall not make for yourself an idol or a likeness of anything in heavens above, etc., not to make any statues or images. They see that as a commandment that stands on its own. Now see, the Catholics don't understand that as a commandment that stands on its own, as we'll see, because making statues is not in itself prohibited. What's prohibited is making an idol or an image in the context of having other gods, okay? So it's not about making statues, period. And so the Protestant division really wants to put emphasis on don't carve anything. But that, I naturally agree with the Catholic division that I don't think that stands out here as its own separate commandment. I think it's part of the commandment of not serving other gods. So let's look then at the 10th, or the 9th and the 10th commandments. So number 9, if we read in Deuteronomy, it says, you shall not covet. But the word here in Hebrew, chamad, is actually a different verb. Don't covet your neighbor's wife, is different than when it says you shall not desire, avah, your neighbor's house. So actually we see in Scripture that it's not just saying don't covet generally. It's using two different words, and I think we should actually all be quite happy with this because it's a recognition that the wife is not your neighbor's property. So there are two different things going on. To desire your neighbor's wife is a different kind of desire than to desire your neighbor's goods. So we can talk about lust on the one hand and greed on the other, okay? So we recognize that there is a formal similarity, but really, we're talking in terms of the moral difference, we're talking about two different types of sin.
So
to covet one's neighbor's wife or...
Slightly different in meaning.
Say again?
Covet and desire are slightly different in meaning.
Well, so in this translation, but often it will use covet to translate
Right.
both. But what's being missed here is that actually in the Hebrew, these are two different verbs.
So covet's more like a lustful desire.
In this context, yes.
And, okay.
Exactly. So I think this is further evidence that these two are properly distinguished from each other, whereas the Protestants would treat them as simply one. And Aquinas has this to say: since the making of graven things or the likeness of anything is not forbidden, except to the point of their being worshipped as gods, since God commanded an image of the seraphim to be made and placed in the tabernacle, Augustine more fittingly unites these two. Thou shalt not have strange gods before me, and thou shalt not make any graven thing, into one precept. So our division of the Ten Commandments follows St. Augustine, his division. So that's a brief detour, hopefully a helpful word about all of that. All right, so
are they ever numbered in the Hebrew?
No, that's the problem. Is that there really is, so Jewish tradition divides them differently as well, because the Scripture basically just says here are the 10. In fact, it doesn't even call them commandments. It calls them in Hebrew the 10 words, the 10 devarim. So there are 10 things here. How exactly you divide them to get 10 is kind of anybody's guess. But this is how Catholics have traditionally done it, and I think it's a logical way. Yes.
Just a question.
Yeah.
is my assumption is that the Protestant translations are using the Masoretic text, and then is the Catholic translation using the 70, the
the Septuagint.
The Septuagint.
Yeah, it's not only issues of manuscripts, but also the Ten Commandments in Scripture appear twice, in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And so even there we have some differences. So it's not strictly a textual problem, but it goes beyond that as well. Yeah, Jim.
Is in like the broader umbrella of Abrahamic religions, is Catholicism unique in allowing depictions of God? Because you don't do that in Islam, and you don't do that in Judaism, and I guess you don't do it in Protestantism either.
Yeah.
So it's kind of unique in that respect. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah. Well, in depicting God, yes, and that's actually part of the. I mean, this was part of the debate within the early church. So there was a movement of what was called iconoclasm, of Christians saying we shouldn't have any images, especially images representing God. But part of the theological defense of the Christian use of images, it's not surprising that Christians are unique in this regard, because part of the reason why God specifically prohibits the use of images, except in very specific cases in the Old Testament, is that he says, when I came among you, I took no form. So God never appeared to the Israelites in taking a particular form. But of course, in the incarnation, God does take a form. And so the early Christians understood that as changing the economy of images. Of how we relate to images is different now, because God has in fact taken on materiality. And so our relationship to art and artistic depictions, even of the divine, changes because of that. So it's a good question. Wow, we got good questions on this. Okay, yeah, let's go.
Is there also a relationship of why they don't believe in Mary, Blessed Mother? Is that associated with it at all? Or is that
no, I think, that's there. I think those are probably in another category. Although I will say, I think part of the Protestant suspicion of Catholic veneration of saints generally is because of a difference in understanding worship. So because Protestants don't offer sacrifice in the Mass, right? The Mass is an offering of sacrifice, and that is proper worship that is only given to God. We don't offer Mass to the saints. We offer Mass to God only, because that is properly worship. You might sing a song, you might kiss a statue, you might even bow down to honor a person, but for us, none of those things constitute worship, because worship, properly speaking, is sacrifice. Whereas Protestants, because they don't offer sacrifice, their worship is constitutive of singing songs and having these celebrations. So now it's confusing of like, well, that's what we do for God, so how can you do that for Mary? Because there's a difference in understanding of what is worship, actually. So that, I think, gets to the heart of this. Let's keep going, because like I said, we haven't even gotten to the. Well, if you have something afterwards, we'll keep going. But we are pressed for time, and I don't want to run out. So we've got the 10. We've talked before about how they can be divided: thought, word, and deed. On the first table, right? Loving God in thought, word, and deed. Over here, love your neighbor in thought, word, and deed. Right? Everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So I want to work tonight. We've covered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Tonight I want to work backwards and touch on these things in reverse order. So we've said something about why 9 and 10 are, why they're here, why they're separated, where you won't always find them enumerated in this way. So now let's move up to number 8 and talk a little bit about bearing false witness or lying. Okay, so what morality ought to govern speech? How do we know when speech is good? What is good speech? What sorts of questions do we need to ask ourselves to determine When is speech good speech?
When it is truthful.
Okay.
And just.
Yeah, okay, so truth and justice, yeah. But what are our go-to questions when asking questions of goodness?
What is it?
What is it? And what is it for? Okay. So speech, we have to then ask ourselves, well, what is the intrinsic purpose? What is the nature of speech such that we're not distorting it? Okay? So what is speech? What is it for? And then we can know, well, is this speech fulfilling the nature of what speech really is? Or is it distorting that in some way? So that's the approach that Aquinas takes. So remember, justice is about giving to each one what is their due, right? Someone's right, what is owed to them. We had that conversation about justice. We talked about the different types of justice. What an individual owes to the community, what the community owes to the individual, and what individuals owe to each other. Now, a conversation or acts of speech would be regulated by this kind of justice, because here we are individuals engaged in a conversation. So I'm saying something to you. So the equality that obtains here, remember we talked last time about equality that's arithmetical versus geometrical? So whether it's proportional or whether it's equal in terms of one for one. Okay. Well, because speech acts are this kind of commutative justice, one-to-one, there needs to be an equality between what is said and the reality that it's reflecting. So let's see what Aquinas has to say about truth and justice. He says, now, the virtue of truth has two things in common with justice. First, it is directed to another. So justice always concerns relations, and speech always concerns relations, right? When we're talking about speech, you're not just talking to yourself, but you're communicating to someone else. So it's a relational issue. So first, it is directed to another, inasmuch as one person manifests to another the things that concern himself. So when you're speaking, what is implicit in the speech act is that you are reflecting what is in your mind, right? You have an idea that is purely internal, but speech is a way of manifesting the idea that you have in your mind, okay? Second, justice sets up a certain equality between things. And this is the virtue of truth does also, for it equals signs to the things which concern man himself. So the signs would be the words, whether spoken or written. Those are the signs, and then the thing itself. Well, in this case, then the correlation would be there needs to be an equality between the sign, the words that I'm using, and the thing itself, that is, the thoughts that they are intending to convey. So when does speech then become disordered is when there is a deliberate disconnect between what I'm actually thinking and what I'm communicating through speech. That would be a failure of truth, because now there's an inequality. I have an idea, I have a belief in my mind, and I give you now words that communicate a different meaning. Because we recognize that if someone is simply wrong, and they tell you something that's wrong, that's not a lie, right? Because what they believe and what they're telling you are the same thing. So they might be wrong, but they're not lying. Lying is when they have one idea, but what they're telling you is a different thing. Now that's a disconnect, right? So Aquinas will go on. He says, a lie is evil since it is an action bearing on undue matter. For, as words are naturally signs of intellectual acts, it is unnatural and undue for anyone to signify by words something that is not in his mind. A lie is sinful not only because it injures one's neighbor, and this is an important sort of clarification. A lie is sinful not only because it injures one's neighbor, but also on account of its disorderedness. Now, it is not allowed to make use of anything disordered in order to ward off harm from another. So, according to this, according to the nature of what it is to speak, is it okay to lie in order to have some other good effect? No. because it's intrinsically disordered. So it's not about, well, we should speak in such a way that good things come about. Well, that's not the nature of speech. It's not the job of speech to make good things come about. Part of the problem with that is that we don't actually control the consequences of what we say. We don't have a way of calculating, well, if I say this, this will happen. No, what regulates speech is the nature of speech, which is truth. Okay? So even if one is telling a lie in order to ward off some harm, and you can think of a million different scenarios of that, it is still intrinsically disordered and therefore wrong. Now, you can go back and read this section of the Summa, and of course Aquinas will distinguish between lies that are more or less serious. Of course, in the Catholic tradition, we talk about mortal sin versus venial sin. And so he will acknowledge that there might be situations in which a person is essentially coerced into lying or feels very little power to do other than to lie. And so the
like if Nazis ask you if you're hiding any Jews, you lie, right? And
well,
that's the right thing to do.
No. and this is the distinction, is that it's he will also talk about in certain cases that you don't owe, because justice is also about giving to one what is their due. And so he says, obviously, the truth can be withheld from people, but that is different than deliberately perverting or disordering the act through speech. Now, if you're lying to save a person's life, is that a mortal sin? Aquinas would say absolutely not. It's very clearly not. But it is still intrinsically disordered. And this is part of even what I really wanted to, some of you I spoke with afterwards, the conversation last week about sexual ethics and so forth. I think we have to remember that there are similar things at play there. That there's a tendency that because there are exceptional cases, and cases which are very difficult to judge, that we say, well, we really ought to throw out the rules. But I think it's much better to recognize that the rules are there and are fixed. They're unchanging. So we don't say that, well, sometimes it's good to lie. No, actually, it's never in and of itself good to lie. Okay? So lying is always an evil because lying is always a disordered act. It is always contrary to the nature of speech. Now, are there times when lying is worse than others, where it is truly harmful to your neighbor? Yes. And that is a grave sin. Okay? Are there lies, even Aquinas will, as always, you can imagine I'm condensing so much here, he'll talk about like joking. Okay. When you're just joking, is that disordered? Well, yes. Is it a serious offense? No. Okay? So, but we have to be able to make and be willing to make those distinctions and not say, well, actually sometimes lying is good. No, lying is never good in itself because it's always disordered, because it's the nature of speech. And again, we don't like that. Well, then you're back to the drawing board of what you even mean by good anymore. Because good by its definition means that it is ordered to its proper end, okay? Whether we like that end or not. Just like we maybe used this example before, but like if there's a bomb that's planted underneath this church and it goes off, well, it's a good bomb as far as bombs go, right? Maybe we don't want it to go off, but that's its goal, that's its purpose. So if it doesn't go off, it's a bad bomb. Maybe that's good for us. We want it to be bad, but it's still the nature of goodness or badness to achieve its purpose. And the purpose of bombs is to explode. The purpose of speech is to communicate the truth. And so anytime you have speech that is deliberately ordered against the truth, it's bad. Okay? In certain situations, you might like that it's bad, but we recognize that it is still intrinsically disordered. Yeah?
Is that the only purpose of speech?
What do you have in mind?
Well, I guess I'm thinking, you talked about joking.
Yeah.
And it seems that there are sounds we make for mirth with our voices.
Yeah,
that
like
are
laughing.
not designed for the primary purpose of communicating data.
Every speech act communicates something from within the mind, right? Even like laughing. If I'm laughing, I'm indicating that it's funny. It's kind of analogically a speech act, but
Yeah.
it's still a communication of an internal act, right?
But it's not always an internal act of data. Like, so like it seems like there's lots of jokes,
Yeah.
and then we could get to singing. But there's lots of jokes where sort of the whole purpose is like showing that what's in your mind is not what the other person was expecting.
Yeah, right. But even in that case, like when we're telling jokes, or even maybe like poetry might be a good example, where you're just kind of rhyming, and there's some kind of artistic quality to the sound and the pattern of the words, even separate from their meaning. But even still, what's being conveyed is, something in the mind that is of an aesthetic value that's being shared, right?
Right, but I don't know that we can then say true or false.
Yeah. Well, okay. Fine. In that case, if we have speech acts that are purely aesthetic, that don't even have a truth value, then it's kind of outside of this realm. But if one is communicating with words, such as to give the impression that one is communicating data, then it would be a lie, right? Okay.
The Jews understand it in that way because Moses and his successors seem to have broken that rule in the event where God allowed it, for example. So Joshua would send spies into cities, right, to lie. Or Moses would send to kill people,
right,
in a premeditated way.
Yeah.
Did they understand it in that way?
Yeah, it's a good question. So within the context of the Old Testament, we often see figures, even heroic figures, that seem to make some exception to some of these rules. I mean, we could go down the list of all the Ten Commandments, and there appear to be, with killing, with stealing, with lying. So not everything is sort of for an example. I think we could still judge it on an objective level. And again, you get into questions of like espionage, like we're talking about, like, well, if you're a spy, is it possible not to lie as a spy? I don't know. That's above my pay grade. No, I'm not. I'm not in those things. But I think what we're doing here is just judging the acts objectively, and this is that tradition. So
it seems to me that the Ten Commandments are really kind of more like categories, not really laws. So, like lying is, the law says you can't lie unless God says you can lie, right? And then so it's a category about lying.
Yeah.
And then you can lie under certain circumstances, under others you can't.
Yeah, and there is a tradition that goes in that direction. I have a hard time with that because I think it's not clear to me how somebody could square all of those things together when God is creating exceptional cases. I think my belief is that there is a consistent moral whole. Sometimes there may be ambiguity. So even in the case of lying, there would be what we call like mental reservations, where you're saying something that is in and of itself not true, not untrue, but the effect is sort of left to someone else. So there are gray areas, I don't doubt that. But I really want to get on to the next thing, because the juicy part that I have been promising, we've got 25 minutes left, is where we're going next. So we'll see, okay? So that's speech acts. I think the last thing, I was going to mention this. So the Catechism mentions a few different things under the category of the 8th commandment. One of them, I think very common, but it's worth having a good name for this, is what the Catechism calls detraction. That is, disclosing the faults of another to one who does not have the right to know. So this is not lying, but falls under the principle of the eighth commandment because it concerns justice. Okay? So if I am telling the faults of another person to someone who has a right to know, so for instance, someone has committed a criminal act and I inform the police, okay? The police have a right to know someone has broken the law. Or if we're talking about a child and I tell their parents the child did this, okay, that person, the parent, has a right to know what their child has done. But what is meant here by detraction is that if I'm telling you her faults, and really it doesn't concern you at all.
It's sort of like gossip.
It's right. Gossip would be another word we could use here, but we realize why it's formally wrong is because it's a matter of justice. I'm giving something to someone that is not what is owed to them, right? So this person doesn't have a right to know the faults of another. And so Aquinas will then actually also form it the other way around, which is that I am stealing or robbing someone of their right to a good name. Okay? So if someone else doesn't have a right to know what this person has done, now again, if it's a situation where this person is dangerous and I'm warning you about them, so okay, now I've judged that you have a right to know. But when we're just gossiping, when we're just talking about people behind their backs, that's a violation of justice in two ways. You're giving one something that is not owed to another person, but then you're also stealing or robbing from someone their honor, their right to a good name. So something to be mindful of because it's very easy. I think we all can very quickly fall into this. So it's good to have during these last few days of Lent, you make a confession that detraction is something you might mention in the confession. Okay, so these are orders of speech. What is ordered speech? What is good speech? The last thing that we're going to talk about is property. Okay, so a quick reminder of the different types of justice, what is owed to the community, what is owed between individuals. So general justice, what we owe to the community, what the community then owes to the individual, and what we owe to each other in commutations. Right. So first we have to ask ourselves, when we're thinking about property and property rights, what is the very nature of property? What is property? What is it for? Okay? What is it? What is it for? That's how we can judge these things as good or bad. So here's what Aquinas has to say about natural property rights. It says two things are competent to man in respect of exterior things, possessions, right? One is the power to procure and dispense them. And in this regard, it is lawful for someone to possess property. Okay? So it's proper for a person to be able to procure and to dispense with external things, to have them as one's own. And he gives at least three reasons why. This is necessary to human life for three reasons. First, because every man is more careful to procure what is for himself alone than that which is common. Okay? So it's clear it's easier for us to work and to make things when it's clear to whom do they belong, right? If everything was in common, the motivations even for working, for producing would be hindered. Secondly, because human affairs are conducted in more orderly fashion, if each man is charged with taking care of some particular thing himself. So because this object belongs to you and that object belongs to me, it's clear whose responsibility it is to take care of each. If there is no property that is private to an individual, then who has care of the thing also becomes obscured. Okay? Lastly, because a more peaceful state is ensured to persons if each one is contented with his own. Okay? So there can be more peace if everybody has what they need and there's not a constant rummaging through common goods. But if everybody has what they need, there can be more peace. So these are some of the reasons why it's natural for individuals to possess property. But remember, he says there are two things competent. One is this power of possession. But the second, he says, the second thing that is competent to men with regard to external things is their use. So how then do you use a thing? And he says, on this respect, man ought to possess external things not as his own, but as common, so that, to wit, he is ready to communicate them to others in their need. Hence the Apostle Paul says, charge the rich of this world to give easily to communicate to others. So things are private in their ownership. We have private property for the sake of caring for things. But in terms of the use of things, we have to recognize that the use of a thing, whatever it is that I'm using, even though it belongs to me, I always have a responsibility to use it in such a way that it is for the good of the whole. Okay. Now, this is a particular understanding of private property that pushed against, for instance, some of the ancient Romans had a very radical view of the rights of private property, so that what belonged to an individual was not only their own to care for and to enjoy, but the use of it, whatever, was entirely their own right. So, for instance, if I have, 30 acres of corn, and I decide that I'm just going to burn it all down because I don't care, well, that's using it in a way that is contrary to the good of the whole community. And so Aquinas would see that as still disordered, because yes, it is your field, but the use of the field still has to be ordered towards the common good. Your use of it is not arbitrary. Just because it's yours to enjoy and to care for doesn't mean that anything you do with it is licit. Okay? So that's the distinction. So yes, private property, but the right to private property is not absolute. And the principle here is what the church calls the universal destination of goods. Meaning everything that is, the way that God made the world, is to be enjoyed by everyone. Now, we divide things in terms of private property for the reasons of order that Aquinas gave, but that doesn't mean that they are solely for private use. Their use is for the common good. Okay. So how might that work itself out in some different ways? Well, the universal destination of goods, Aquinas says, hence, whatever certain people have in superabundance is due by natural law to the purpose of succoring the poor. For this reason, St. Ambrose says, it is the hungry man's bread that you withhold, the naked man's cloak that you store away. The money that you bury in the earth is the price of the poor man's ransom and freedom. So what Aquinas is saying here is that what a person has in superabundance, what a person has in excess beyond what they need for themselves, belongs by natural right to those who do not have what they need. Because again, the use, the purpose of having private property is for the sake of the common good. And so if what I have in excess is to the detriment of someone who is in need, then the principle, and he quotes here St. Ambrose, but all of the church fathers are repeating this again and again, that what one person has in excess is in effect a kind of stolen property from those who are poor. Because it belongs, again, Aquinas is not accidental here in using this term, the natural law, that it belongs to them by a natural right. So we could go back to that triangle of general and distributive justice. So that's why, as societies, we create systems like this, because how then I negotiate what I have in excess and versus who needs what can be very complicated for a society to govern, but we have mechanisms in place by which those who have excess can give to a fund that is then used to help those who have a deficit. So it's very clear then that for people who want to use slogans like taxation is theft, Aquinas certainly would not see it that way, right? That actually it's quite the other way around, that what one person possesses and sort of the wealth that they bury in the earth is in fact itself a kind of stolen good, because its natural use would be to be distributed to those who are in need. Yes?
Does that kind of cross over from to like the gifts that you have, as far as like
Yeah.
teaching or coaching, or that you're kind of obligated then to give of that if that's what you excel at, or having a super abundance.
Yeah, exactly. So we share what we have, whether it be material goods or other types of goods, for the common good. Yeah, exactly. All right. So this is the kind of justice that we're talking about here, general and distributive justice. So again, a person, for instance, because a person needs food in order to survive, then by virtue of existing, by virtue of being a human person, every person has a right to food. Okay? So people have rights to food. John the 23rd was very good at articulating this, that there are intrinsic human rights, such that every person, by virtue of being a person, is owed something, those things that are essential to their survival. So then who owes it? Well, again, it's not necessarily that person A owes it to person B, because they don't have any intrinsic relationship, but as a social whole, there is a responsibility that obtains on that society to care for their poor. And so this is the work of general and distributive justice. But now, let's turn to commutative justice, exchanges between individuals. Because that, remember, is governed by an arithmetical equality. That every time we buy or sell, there should be an equality between what you get and what I get, right? If we're buying and selling, and every time we do that, I'm somehow getting richer and richer and richer, and you're getting poorer, well, something has failed. Because exchanges should be equal. That's the nature of commutative justice. There should be equality. So what are some ways in which that doesn't happen? Well, here's how Aquinas puts this. So, buying and selling seem to be established for the common advantage of both parties. Now, whatever is established for the common advantage should not be more of a burden to one party than to another. And consequently, all contracts between them should observe equality of thing and thing. Right? That's what we're saying. So if we're exchanging goods, there should be an equality. So if I have 2 sheep and you have 1 cow, and we decide in this context that that's a fair exchange, then we exchange, right? So there's a recognition that there's an equality between these 2 goods, okay? That can also then, we can use money to stand in for. That's what money is. Money is a stand-in for the exchange of goods, right? So it's something that we use, that, as Aquinas will say, that humans have invented money for the purpose of simplifying these types of exchanges. But still, the same principle applies, that there should be an equality here, right? So there would be an injustice for someone who pays too much, so someone who charges too much, or someone who pays too little, that would be an injustice, because it's a lack of equality. Now again, these are obviously not strict things, because lots of factors come into play, but in principle, there should be an equality here. And part of it is about the common advantage of both parties, that one party is not being disadvantaged. Okay. Now, he says, he that buys a thing in order that he may sell it entire and unchanged at a profit is the trader who is cast out of God's temple. So this is a commentary on the, Jesus driving out the money changers, which actually is today, Monday, the Monday after Palm Sunday. Jesus goes into the temple and drives out the money changer. And Aquinas here quotes from St. John Chrysostom, says that the one who buys a thing in order that he may sell it entire and unchanged at a profit is the trader who is cast out of God's temple. Okay, so let's give an example. Let's say I have 2 sheep and I trade for your cow. And then I take that cow and I go to somebody else and I trade it for 3 sheep. Right? Now I'm just playing a game. I'm just looking out and cutting deals and gradually accumulating more and more to myself. Now, am I actually doing any work or contributing to the common good? So I'm amassing now more and more wealth, but I'm not, but there is an inequality of these exchanges, apparently, right? somewhere there is an inequality because no one is improving, as he says, no work is being done. I'm not changing the thing to make it more valuable, right? If I buy a house and do all kinds of repairs and then resell it for more, well, that's different because I'm now the profit is the profit that I've generated by the work that was done. But if I'm just trading for profit, that's only possible because there's some kind of inequality that's going on. So he says he may lawfully do this if he has bettered the thing, or because the value of the thing is changed with the change of place or time, or on account of the danger he incurs in transferring the thing from one place to another, or again in having it carried by another. So again, if I go over, if I go to the East Coast and buy up a bunch of stuff that we don't have over here, and I carry it, well, now maybe I can sell it for more than I paid for it because I've done the work of transporting it. So there are a lot of exceptions to this, but one who trades purely for a profit is gaming the system. And there's an inequality in the exchange such that a person is gaining wealth without contributing by any work to the common good. So this is in the Summa under what he calls cheating, what the tradition will also call speculation, right? So speculation is something that the church has condemned as a vice because it's simply trying to project of what will be more valuable, and so I buy it now to sell it later at a price, but no work is being done to better the thing. It's purely using money to make more money. And that is contrary to the natural use of money, which is to exchange for goods as they're needed. So this is one iteration of this. So he'll say exchange of things is twofold. One natural, as it were necessary, whereby one commodity is exchanged for another, or money taken in exchange for a commodity in order to satisfy the needs of life. So this, he says, is an exchange that is natural and necessary, right? You buy what you need in order to survive, right? So this is natural and necessary. What is unnatural, he says, the other kind of exchange is either that of money for money or of any commodity for money, not on account of the necessities of life, but for profit. Okay? So trading, not because you need the thing that you're trading for, but simply for profit, is an unnatural kind of exchange. He says this is deserving of blame because considered in itself, it satisfies the greed for gain which knows no limit and tends to infinity. So we had used that expression, I think, before about tending to infinity, right? Because if I'm collecting sheep, because I need sheep on my farm for wool and so forth, well, there's a kind of natural limit to how many sheep I would want or could take care of and so forth. So there's a natural limit to that of how many sheep do you really need. But when it comes to something that we're doing purely for profit, when we're just exchanging money, there is no natural limit to that. I can always, if what I'm doing is not because of a need that I have, but just for gain, well, that will keep going and going and going. And so it satisfies not a need, but the greed for gain which knows no limit and tends to infinity. Yeah?
So for example, employees that receive, let's say, stock.
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you qualify that? Because it's going to be on the on the market, on the stock exchange. So does it fall in that category or not? Because many companies do that, right? So it's a way to compensate employees, right? Instead of, let's say, going with additional salaries, which would knock a lot of income adjustment tax.
Yes. So actually, stake of ownership in a company, especially in one that one works for, is actually what the church sees as ideal and the most natural relationship. Is that in fact every employer would be some kind of cooperative owner in the enterprise, such that the work that is being done, I'm working for company A, presumably making A more profitable, and therefore as the company grows in value, I should not only receive wages, but I should receive a proportional benefit as the company as a whole is benefiting. And so something like that, and there are a lot of granular situations we could talk about, but in principle, actually, employee, those kinds of stock options could be ideal depending on the situation. There's one more thing that we're going to talk about, just like last week. I only went 5 minutes over last week, okay? So we might go 5 minutes over today, but it's also our last week, okay? So here we go. Aquinas makes this distinction. He says, we must observe that there are certain things the use of which consists in their consumption. Thus, we consume wine when we use it for drink. Okay? Is that clear? So it's understood that the use of wine is the drinking of wine, and therefore, to really use a bottle of wine is to destroy it, right? So whoever is granted the use of the thing is granted the thing itself, and for this reason. Accordingly, if a man wanted to sell wine separately from the use of the wine, he would be selling the same thing twice, or he would be selling what does not exist, wherefore he would evidently commit a sin of injustice. So, let's say I give you a bottle of wine, and I don't charge you anything up front, but I'm going to take a payment in a month from now. So a month from now, I come back and I say, okay, so the bottle of wine is $20, and also I would like, in return, in addition to the $20, I would also like the wine back. Right? Well, what have I done there? I've sold the same thing twice, because it's assumed that if I'm selling you the wine, that you're drinking it. Right? That's the natural use of the wine. So you can either have the wine back, or you can have the money. You don't get both. So that's why he says it's either selling the same thing twice, or it's selling something that doesn't exist. Okay? So in that case, what is sold is the wine and the use of the wine, which he says is unnatural and is an injustice. Whereas we could contrast that with, say, a house. On the other hand, there are things that the use of which does not consist in their consumption. Thus, to use a house is to dwell in it, not to destroy it. Wherefore, in such things both may be granted. For instance, one man may hand over to another the ownership of his house, while reserving to himself the use of it for a time, or vice versa. He may grant the use of the house while retaining the ownership. So, the use of a house, unlike the use of a bottle of wine, doesn't destroy it. So, I could give you my house, and a month later, come back and say, okay, I would like payment, and I would also like my house back. Right? That's rental. Right? So it makes sense to divide something that is not a consumable good in that way, because the thing and the use of the thing are separable. Unlike in the wine, where the thing and the use of it are not separable. So in the case of a house, it's not unjust to give someone the use of a house, to charge them for it, and then also expect the thing back in return. Okay, so that's the normal structure of a rental, but you wouldn't do that with a consumable good like wine. So you don't get your money back and the wine back, because that's selling it twice. So how does that? What's Aquinas driving at here? Well, let's see. Oh, this is the same thing. Yeah, okay, no. So he may grant the use of the house while retaining the ownership. For this reason, a man may lawfully charge for the use of his house and also reclaim the house from the person to whom he has granted its use, as happens in renting. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. But usury. What is usury? So we have a tendency to think that usury is excessive interest, right? That's what is often understood as usury. Aquinas, the medievals, the whole tradition of the church, has understood usury in this way. Money was invented chiefly for the purpose of exchange, and consequently the proper and principal use of money is its consumption or alienation, whereby it is sunk in exchange. So again, if I loan you money, it's assumed that in loaning you money, it's because you need to spend it. So it is being consumed in its use. So if I loan you $20, and I come back later and I say, okay, what do you owe me back? Well, you owe me back the $20. And then also, another $5 for having used it. That's selling the same thing twice. Okay? So, hence, by its very nature, unlawful to take payment for the use of money lent, which payment is known as usury. So it's called usury because it's a charge on the use of the thing in addition to what is the principal of the loan. So in simple terms, for a personal loan, which would be different than, say, an investment or other sorts of things, but if we're talking about a personal loan, to require more in return than was given is a natural injustice. Because if I loan you $20, an exchange would be $20. That's an equality, right? If I am getting in return more than I lent, I'm now exchanging at a profit, which is unnatural and unjust in terms of what are fair exchanges.
$20 isn't worth $20 in a year.
Yeah, so we might. No, it's true. Okay, so there might be these types of cases where values shift, and there might be exceptions to that. But again, then the goal there is not profit, and that's what he's driving at is that if it's understood that there's an equality of exchange, that's what's ideal. So even if we're changing currency or whatever, the idea is that the principal, what is loaned, is equal to what is returned. That's the ideal. So actually, the Catechism, the Roman Catechism, says, among those who are guilty of robbery also belong usurers, the most cruel and relentless of extortioners. And it defines very particularly, whatever is received above the capital and principal, be it money or anything else that may be purchased or estimated by money, is usury. For our Lord says, lend, hoping for nothing in return. So the principle there is that lending should be an act of charity and not driven by profit. Okay, so lending for the sake of profit is contrary to this natural justice. Benedict XIV says this: one cannot condone the sin of usury by arguing that the gain is not great or excessive, but rather moderate or small. Neither can it be condoned by arguing that the borrower is rich, nor even by arguing that the money borrowed is not left idle, but is spent usefully, either to increase one's fortune, to purchase new estates, or to engage in business transactions. The law of governing loans consists necessarily in the equality of what is given and returned. Once the equality has been established, whoever demands more than that violates the terms of the loan. Now, I think this is really remarkable because, like what we mentioned last week, everybody knows the church's teaching on contraception, and it's hard, right? And it's hard to live in modern society and even imagine a world in which there's no contraception because it is so intrinsic to the way our society works. And it's the same with this. It's hard for us even to imagine what would the world look like because our whole society, our whole economy is built on these types of operations where money is made by having money. And through a system of loaning and interest, one can generate money through trade. What's fascinating then is that there's actually a parallel here. That usury attempts to make what is sterile to be fertile. So usury takes money which is purely for the sake of exchange and does not naturally generate anything of its own and uses it to make more of itself, which is contrary to the nature of money. Whereas contraception is doing the opposite. It's taking something that is naturally fertile and rendering it sterile. Now I put this image up here because, as I mentioned to some of you before, I think some people, when they hear one of these things, they go, yeah, that's right, that's right. And then they hear the other, and it's like, I don't know about that. Because our political paradigm is basically built on these two wings, where some people want more liberty, so to speak, in one area, say in matters of trade and economics, and another group wants more liberty, so to speak, in matters of sexual expression and so forth. But what we have to remember is where we started. What is the real meaning of liberty? what is true freedom? Because again, when it comes to economics, people say, oh, free market. Well, does the church believe in free markets? Yes. But what do you mean by free? Because free does not mean everybody does what they want, but everyone acts in accord with right reason and the natural law. And therefore, Leo reminds us, Pope Leo, many there are who follow in the footsteps of Lucifer and adopt as their own his rebellious cry, I will not serve, and consequently substitute for true liberty what is sheer and most foolish license. So, the last thing I want to recommend to all of you, two things. One is this book, The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. So this is essentially a catechism. This is published by the Vatican. It is a catechism, but specifically for the Church's social teaching. So it goes through all of these different issues, whether it's issues of labor and capital, economics, morality, religious liberty, all of those things. This is, I think, a very, very helpful guide to understanding how the Church's position has nothing even to do with the paradigm that we so often fall into of thinking of left and right. The Church is simply not on that spectrum because it has a fundamentally different understanding of the nature of politics, the nature of the good, the nature of freedom and liberty. So I highly recommend this as a resource, a guide. And the last thing is what you've seen me promoting before, this book, Practical Theology. So in a couple of weeks, I have all of your emails. If I don't have your email, come share it with me up here on your way out. But I would love in the coming weeks, sometime after Easter, to take some time. So each of these, you can see each page, one single page is a whole article. Okay? So you read only one page and you've read a whole article on some given topic within the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. So I think it would be great to get a little more interactive, and in the time that I have left here to start something like this, where we can read a few of these and come together and discuss on a more kind of roundtable environment. If you'd be interested in that, pick up this book. I'll be emailing out more information. After Easter, we'll get something like this started. Thank you so much. It's been so great to have all of this time together.